Ever wonder what life was really like for women in the distant past? Did you ever stop to think about the struggles and the hidden burdens they carried, day in and day out, simply to survive? What if I told you that back in 760, countless women across the world were trapped in a web of exploitation so intricate, so ingrained in society, that escaping it seemed almost impossible? What were the hidden costs of their labor? The silent sacrifices they made? Get ready, because we are about to pull back the dusty veil of history and peek into the often overlooked world of women workers in 760, at exploring the very real ways their lives were shaped by systems designed to take and take and take. Number 5. Wage suppression and undervaluation. Imagine a world where your daily toil, the sweat on your brow, and the ache in your bones were simply considered part of the natural order of things, barely worthy of acknowledgement, let alone fair compensation. In 760, across vast swaths of the globe, this was the stark reality from millions of women. Their labor, essential to the very fabric of society and the survival of their households, was systematically suppressed in terms of value, often merging pike into the unquantified sphere of household duties, or simply paid at a fraction of what a man might receive for a similar or even less demanding task. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deeply embedded aspect of the economic and social structures of the time, a silent, pervasive form of exploitation that sapped women of their autonomy and trapped them in cycles of unending work with little reward. Consider a small village nestled in the heart of what would one day become France, part of the nascent Carolingian Empire in 760 AD. Here, women like Elara spent their days immersed in a ceaseless cycle of agricultural labor. From dawn until dusk, Elara would be in the fields, bent over, weeding the barley, helping to spread manure, or meticulously harvesting crops. She would carry heavy baskets of freshly cut grain on her back, walking miles to the communal threshing floor. Her hands, gnarled and calloused, bore testament to the unyielding demands of the soil. Yet, when the harvest was brought in and the Lord's portion was taken, the paltry share that remained for her family was considered the fruit of everyone's labor, but her specific, intense effort was rarely, if ever, directly compensated. The concept of a wage for her work in the fields was almost alien. It was simply what women did to help the family survive. Historians studying early medieval manorial systems have consistently highlighted how women's agricultural contributions, though absolutely vital to the output and sustenance of the entire estate, were rarely itemized or valued separately in estate records or rent payments. They were part of a collective family unit, and any compensation, meager as it might be, flowed through the male head of the household. Beyond the fields, Elara's work continued. She would spend countless hours grinding grain into flour, using a heavy hand mill, a task that demanded immense upper body strength and endurance, her arms aching with the repetitive motion. She would then bake bread, tend the small kitchen garden, spin flax into thread, weave cloth and mend clothes for her entire family. Each of these tasks was incredibly time-consuming and required considerable skill and knowledge passed down through generations, yet none of it was monetized. It was simply her duty as a woman, as a wife, as a mother. A man might be paid a small sum for repairing a tool or working a specific job for the Lord, but the intricate web of domestic production that kept the household functioning and clothed was invisible to the prevailing economic system. Scholars examining the economic treatises and household management guides from this period, like some fragments from the Capitulare de Viis, showed detailed instructions for men's roles and outputs, but often treat women's domestic production as an inherent, unvalued component of household operations. Travel further east to the flourishing cities of the Tang Dynasty in China, still in its prime in 760. Here, women were often involved in highly skilled trades. None more renowned than silk production. Consider May, who worked in a large silk workshop in Cheng'an. Her fingers, nimble and precise, were adept at unraveling silk cocoons, spinning the delicate fibers into thread, and then operating intricate looms to weave magnificent silk brocades. The demand for Tang silk was global, reaching as far as Byzantium. The finished product was incredibly valuable, a luxury item that signified wealth and status. May would work from before dawn, guided by the dim light of oil lamps, until late into the night, her eyes strained, her back hunched over the loom. The air in the workshop was often thick with silk dust, making breathing difficult, and the repetitive motions led to chronic pains in her wrists and shoulders. Yet, despite the immense value of her output and the highly specialized skills she possessed, May's wages were a fraction of what a male artisan in a comparable trade, like a potter or a metalworker, might earn. Sometimes her payment was not even in coin, but in a meager allowance of coarse grain or cheap cloth, barely enough to sustain her. Employers, often male heads of large workshops, justified this disparity by claiming women's work was lighter, or that their earnings were merely supplemental to their family's income, even if for many like May, their income was the primary source of survival for their parents or children. Ancient Chinese legal codes and merchant guild practices, as unearthed by modern historians, often formalized these wage gaps, explicitly stating lower rates for female labor or classifying certain high-value tasks as men's work, even when women were clearly performing them. This economic subjugation wasn't just about lower pay. It was about the fundamental denial of the intrinsic worth of their labor and their contribution to the burgeoning Tang economy. In the vast Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, the situation echoed similar patterns of undervaluation. Women living in bustling urban centers often engaged in craft production for the marketplace, particularly in textiles, but also in preparing foodstuffs, perfumes, or even intricate leather goods. Zara, in a small alleyway workshop, spent her days dyeing wool. The vibrant colors that emerged from her vats would eventually grace the robes of merchants and scholars, but the process was grueling. She stirred steaming vats of pungent dyes, her hands stained, her lungs irritated by the fumes. The physical demands were significant, and the knowledge of dye recipes and processes was complex. Yet, when she sold her dyed wool to a merchant, or when she was paid for her work within a larger workshop, her remuneration was consistently lower than that of male apprentices, let alone master craftsmen. Prevailing social view, influenced by patriarchal interpretations of religious and cultural norms, often positioned women's economic activities as secondary to men's, thereby justifying suppressed wages. Islamic legal scholars of the period, while acknowledging a woman's right to own property and engage in trade, did not always translate that into equitable pay for labor, often prioritizing family maintenance by men, which implicitly devalued women's direct economic contributions. This wage suppression wasn't just about income, it was about power. With limited financial resources, women had less control over their own lives, less ability to save, to invest, or to leave exploitative situations. They were perpetually reliant on male relatives or employers, their economic vulnerability making them susceptible to other forms of abuse. The systematic undervaluation of their work became a cornerstone of their broader subjugation, making it incredibly difficult for women in 760 AD to achieve any semblance of economic independence or security, locking them into a relentless cycle of production for others' benefit. Number 4. Forced labor and debt bondage. Beyond the quiet theft of undervaluation, many women in 760 had found themselves trapped in far more overt forms of exploitation, forced labor and debt bondage. This wasn't merely about low wages. It was about the complete absence of any wages, or the obligation to work without choice, often under duress, with their bodies and time considered property to be commanded by others. This horrific reality was a pervasive feature of societies across continents, often interwoven with social status, birth, and the crushing weight of family liabilities. Consider the desperate situation of Anya in the Carolingian lands. She was a serf tied to the land, meaning she and her descendants were bound to serve the local lord. Duke Roland, her life was not her own. From the tender age of 7 or 8, Anya was put to work alongside her mother in the lord's domain, the portion of the estate directly farmed for the lord's benefit. Her days were a relentless cycle of forced labor, weeding endless rows of wheat, hauling heavy stones to clear new fields, spreading dung with her bare hands, and assisting with every stage of the grueling harvest. She worked in all weather conditions, her bare feet often sinking into cold, muddy earth in spring or cracking from the dry heat of summer. She had no say in her work, no ability to refuse, and certainly no expectation of pay. This wasn't employment. It was an obligation, a condition of her birth. Her father and brothers owed their days of labor, and so did she, as part of the family unit. The Lord's bailiff ensured that the required labor was performed, often with a whip to encourage diligence. Historical documents, such as manorial rolls and early legal codes from Germanic kingdoms, clearly delineate the duties and obligations of serfs, explicitly including female serfs in the labor force, whose forced agricultural coffers were integral to the Lord's economic power. Were integral to the Lord's economic powers. Were integral to the Lord's economic power. Were integral to the Lord's economic power. Were integral to the Lord's. When not working the land, she might be ordered to spin wool for the Lord's household, or to spend hours churning butter or pressing cheese in the Lord's dairy. Sometimes, she would be called to serve in the Lord's castle, washing clothes, sweeping floors, or carrying water from the well for hours on end. These tasks were not voluntary. They were part of the feudal contract enforced by the Lord's authority and the constant threat of punishment, a brutal beating, starvation, or even expulsion from the land, which meant certain death in a time of precarious survival. Her body was a tool, her time a resource to be exploited, all without a single coin changing hands. The concept of her freedom was non-existent. She was property, tethered to the soil and the whims of her master. In the bustling cities of the Tang Dynasty, forced labor took on a different but equally cruel form: domestic slavery and debt bondage. Consider Lina, a young woman from a poor family in the countryside. Her family, ravaged by a bad harvest and overwhelming debts to a powerful merchant, had no choice but to offer Lina as collateral. When they could not repay the loan, Lina was sold into servitude. She became a domestic slave in the sprawling mansion of a wealthy official in Luoyang. Her days began before dawn and ended long after midnight. Her duties were endless: preparing elaborate meals in stifling kitchens, meticulously cleaning vast courtyards and numerous rooms, washing mountains of silk garments by hand, tending to the official's children, and carrying heavy loads of water or firewood. She slept on a mat in a cramped servant's quarter, often hungry, always exhausted. Lina was utterly at the mercy of her owners. She could be beaten for the slightest transgression, deprived of food, or even sold again to another household without her consent or knowledge. She had no rights, no personal possessions, and no hope of escape. Her labor was entirely unpaid, her existence defined by servitude. Ancient Chinese legal texts, though sometimes offering theoretical protections against extreme cruelty, largely affirmed the right of slave ownership and the absolute power of masters over their bondservants. Debt bondage, while technically distinct from chattel slavery, often led to indistinguishable conditions, with individuals working off insurmountable debts for generations, effectively becoming slaves to their creditors. Scholars, researching the social history of the Tang period, frequently cite official decrees and private letters that detail the prevalence of domestic slavery, often emphasizing the vulnerability of women and children to such fates due to economic hardship. Across the vast reaches of the Abbasid Caliphate, Forced labor also manifested through domestic servitude and state-imposed work. Fatima was a young woman from a mountainous region, captured during a skirmish with a rival tribe and brought as a captive to Baghdad. She was sold in the slave market to a wealthy merchant, becoming part of his large household. Fatima's life was now one of involuntary servitude. She was put to work in the merchant's textile workshop, where she was forced to spin wool and weave intricate patterns on looms, day after day, year after year. The workshop was often hot and poorly ventilated, the air thick with fibers, and the hours were punishingly long. She received no pay. Her food, meager living quarters, and rough clothing were considered her compensation. Any deviation from her tasks, any sign of resistance, could result in harsh corporal punishment from lashings to solitary confinement. Her captors, and later her owners, saw her as nothing more than a tool to generate wealth, her body and skills entirely at their disposal. The legal framework of the Abbasid Caliphate, while offering specific regulations for the treatment of enslaved people, fundamentally sanctioned slavery, meaning that women like Fatima, stripped of their freedom, had no legal standing to challenge their plight. Historians analyzing Abbasid-era commerce and domestic life have unearthed numerous records of slave transactions, consistently showing women and girls as primary commodities. Desired for both domestic labor and skilled craft production, their human rights utterly disregarded in the face of economic expediency. This systemic forced labor, rooted in conquest, debt, or social hierarchy, utterly stripped women of their agency, their dignity, and their very lives, turning them into unwilling engines of production for the benefit of others. Number 3, physical exertion and hazardous conditions. Beyond the crushing weight of unpaid or forced labor, women in 760 had faced another brutal reality: working environments that pushed their bodies to the absolute brink, often under hazardous conditions, with no thought for their safety or long-term health, no protective gear. The demands of daily survival, coupled with the systemic undervaluation of their lives, meant that women were routinely exposed to extreme physical exertion and dangerous environments, leading to chronic illness, injury, and often premature death. Their suffering was considered an unavoidable byproduct of their existence, their bodies expendable. Consider the harrowing life of Ingrid, a woman in a Germanic village in the Carolingian sphere. Her days were a relentless testament to physical endurance. In addition to her endless agricultural duties, Ingrid was often tasked with fetching water for her family, and at times for the communal well that served several households. This involved carrying heavy wooden buckets, often filled with 5 gallons or more of water, back and forth from the distant river or spring. Multiple times a day, the path was often muddy or icy, uneven and treacherous. Each trip meant lugging perhaps 40 pounds of water, sometimes for half a mile or more, of steep inclines. Her shoulders ached perpetually, her spine curved from the strain, and her feet were raw and blistered. The sheer muscular effort required for the seemingly simple task, performed daily for decades, often led to chronic back pain, joint issues, and premature arthritis. Archaeological findings from early medieval burial sites in Europe frequently show skeletal remains of women with severe spinal degeneration and joint damage, physical markers consistent with repetitive heavy labor. But Ingrid's physical challenges didn't stop there. This involved venturing into the dense, snow-covered forest, chopping down small trees or collecting fallen branches, and then dragging or carrying large bundles back to her home. The cold was biting, her hands numb, her fingers often cut and bleeding from rough bark or sharp axes. Frostbite was a constant threat, and slipping on ice with a heavy load could mean a broken bone, a devastating injury in a time without advanced medical care. Her body was constantly battling the elements and the sheer weight of her tasks. There was no reprieve, no rest. Her daily survival depended on her ability to literally carry the weight of her household on her shoulders, pushing her physical limits until her body gave out. In the bustling workshops of Tang Dynasty China, particularly in the highly specialized and demanding silk industry, women faced different yet equally perilous physical and environmental hazards. Think of Lian, a young woman working in a dye house outside of Chang'an. Her job involved preparing and mixing the vibrant dyes that would give silk its magnificent hues. This meant constantly stirring massive vats of boiling water, infused with minerals, plant extracts, and often toxic compounds. The air in the workshop was thick with caustic fumes, a suffocating mix of ammonia, sulfur, and various metallic salts. Lan's lungs constantly burned, and she suffered from chronic coughs and shortness of breath. Her hands, perpetually immersed in or splashed by hot corrosive dyes, were perpetually raw, cracked, and discolored, often developing painful lesions and infections. The heat in the dye house was relentless, particularly during the hot summer months, leading to constant dehydration and exhaustion. Furthermore, the risk of accidental burns from the boiling vats was ever present, and a slip could lead to horrific, life-threatening injuries. There were no gloves, no masks, no ventilation systems beyond an open doorway. The beauty of the silk came at a tremendous cost to the women who created it, their bodies slowly poisoned and corroded by the very substances they manipulated. Scholarly analysis of historical trade records and limited medical texts from the Tang period occasionally allude to prevalent respiratory illnesses and skin conditions among textile workers, subtly hinting at the hazardous nature of their occupation. Across the Abbasid Caliphate, in the vast agricultural lands irrigated by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, women working in the fields endured extreme physical hardship under the blazing sun. Take Asha, who toiled in a date palm grove south of Baghdad. Her work involved endless hours under the scorching desert sun, temperatures often exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. She would spend her days weeding, clearing irrigation channels, and assisting in the date harvest, which involved strenuous climbing or reaching to gather fruit from tall palms. The physical demands were immense, leading to chronic heat, exhaustion, severe dehydration, and debilitating sunstroke. Her skin was perpetually burnt and cracked, her eyes squinting against the relentless glare. The lack of access to clean drinking water or adequate shade meant that Asha and others like her were constantly battling the elements, their bodies pushed beyond their limits just to bring in the harvest. Beyond the heat, the constant bending and repetitive motions led to severe back pain and joint issues. The exposure to dust, insects, and contaminated water sources also meant they were highly susceptible to diseases. Ancient agricultural manuals and land management texts from the Abbasid period, while focusing on crop yields, implicitly describe labor conditions that would demand immense physical resilience, and archaeological findings. These women were the silent engines of their societies, their health and well-being sacrificed on the altar of production, their bodies slowly broken by the sheer unyielding demands of their daily existence in hazardous conditions with no protective measures or care. Number 2. Control of mobility and association. One of the most insidious forms of exploitation women workers faced in 760 AD wasn't just about what they were forced to do, but about what they were prevented from doing. The systematic control of their mobility and their ability to associate freely with others severely limited their opportunities, stifled their autonomy, and made it nearly impossible for them to escape exploitative situations or advocate for themselves. This control was deeply woven into the legal, social, and cultural fabric of the era, forming invisible chains that bound women to their circumstances, often rendering them utterly dependent and powerless. Consider the life of Frey, a young woman living in a remote village in Anglo-Saxon England in 760 AD. Her life was inextricably tied to her family and the small insular community she was born into. Women like Freya were rarely permitted to travel far from their homes, and certainly not alone. Social norms dictated that a woman's place was within the household or the immediate vicinity of the village. Venturing beyond familiar territory was fraught with danger and social suspicion. If Fry were to consider seeking better work in a different village or even marrying into a family further afield, she would need the explicit permission of her father or, if married, her husband. Without this permission, she would be seen as a runaway, subject to severe societal condemnation and possibly physical reprisal. This control over her physical movement meant that Freya was essentially trapped. If the local lord was particularly harsh, or if her family was struggling with severe poverty, she couldn't simply pack her meager belongings and seek opportunities elsewhere. There was no job market she could freely access, no distant town where she might find better wages or kinder employers. Her world was defined by the boundaries of her village and the expectations of her male relatives. Historians studying early medieval customary law and social structures frequently highlight the limited legal and practical mobility of women, who were often considered under the mund or guardianship of a male relative, restricting their independent actions, including travel or relocation, without explicit consent. This confinement ensured a stable labor pool for local lords and families, but it fundamentally denied women the basic freedom to improve their lot. Journey to the rigid social hierarchies of Tang Dynasty China. Here, women, particularly those of respectable families, were often confined to the inner quarters of their homes. For a woman like Ling, from a modest merchant family in a large city, her world was primarily the family compound, while poorer women or those from lower social strata might have more freedom to move through the marketplace or work in public. Even their movements were often dictated by economic necessity rather than personal choice. For Ling, leaving the house even for a short errand would require an escort and was a carefully considered event, not an everyday occurrence. Independent travel for women was highly uncommon and often viewed with suspicion or as a sign of low moral standing. This severe restriction on mobility had profound implications for Ling's economic opportunities. While she might assist in household production, such as embroidery or preparing goods for sale, she rarely, if ever, directly engaged with the outside market. She could not negotiate prices, seek out better suppliers, or explore alternative trades. Her economic activity was mediated entirely through her male relatives. If she were in an abusive marriage or an exploitative domestic work situation, her ability to escape or seek help was severely hampered by her inability to move freely or communicate without oversight. Historical accounts from the Tang period, including official family admonitions and moralistic tales, consistently emphasize the importance of women's seclusion and their proper place within the domestic sphere, effectively limiting their interactions. In the stratified societies of the Abbasid Caliphate, control over women's mobility and association was also a powerful tool of exploitation. Consider Miriam, a woman working in a large household in Baghdad, responsible for managing the domestic staff and overseeing the preparation of food. While she might have some authority within the household, her movements outside of it were severely restricted. If she needed to purchase supplies, she would typically be accompanied by a male servant, or her tasks would be delegated to male household members. Unchaperoned travel, especially for women of any social standing, was rare and culturally frowned upon, often interpreted as a sign of impropriety or danger. This restriction meant that Miriam had very limited opportunities to interact with other women workers outside her immediate circle, or to learn about alternative employment, or to simply share her experiences and grievances. There was no communal gathering place for women workers to discuss their wages, their working conditions, or to form any kind of collective bond. Such association, even if informal, would be viewed with suspicion, potentially undermining the authority of the male head of the household or the employer. The social emphasis on female modesty and protection often translated into a practical confinement that isolated women, making them more vulnerable to individual exploitation. Early Islamic legal texts and social commentaries, while diverse, generally advocated for the protection and seclusion of women, which inadvertently translated into restrictions on their independent movement and public engagement, severely impacting their agency in labor market. This deliberate or customary curtailment of women's physical freedom and their ability to forge connections meant they were often isolated, making it exceedingly difficult for them to challenge their circumstances or find solidarity. Number 1. Lack of legal or social recourse. The final and perhaps most devastating form of exploitation women workers faced in 760 AD was the near total absence of any meaningful legal or social recourse. If a woman was underpaid, subjected to forced labor, physically abused or confined against her will, she had virtually nowhere to turn. The legal systems of the era, the prevailing social norms, and the deeply entrenched patriarchal structures combined to deny women the ability to seek justice, protect their rights, or challenge the overwhelming power of their male employers, husbands, or lords. Their voices were often silenced, their grievances unheard, and their suffering dismissed as inconsequential. Imagine the plight of Isolde, a young woman in a modest Saxon farming family in Wessex, during the constant political upheaval of the early English kingdoms. Her life was hard, filled with unrelenting labor, yet she accepted it as her lot. However, when her father, desperate for a loan, pledged her services to a local landowner for a year, Isolde found herself in a truly desperate situation. The landowner, a notoriously cruel man, forced her to work beyond the agreed terms, provided her with barely edible food, and subjected her to constant verbal abuse. He refused to let her visit her family effectively, holding her in a state of servitude far exceeding the initial agreement. Isolde had no one to appeal to. She could not go before the local moot or assembly of free men. Her testimony, if even allowed, would be dismissed as secondary to a man's word. She had no legal standing to bring a case against the landowner, who wielded considerable power and influence. Her family, beholden to the landowner for the debt, was powerless to intervene, fearing even harsher repercussions. There were no women holding positions of authority who might listen, no independent legal aid. Her pleas, if she dared to make them, would fall on deaf ears. Early Germanic legal codes, while detailing fines and retributions for various offenses, consistently placed women in a subordinate legal position, requiring male representation in most legal proceedings and granting them limited rights to initiate legal action independently. Now, consider the highly sophisticated, yet still deeply patriarchal, legal system of the Tang Dynasty in China. Even with its elaborate bureaucracy and comprehensive codes, justice for women workers was often elusive. Think of Wen, a skilled weaver working in a private textile workshop in the city of Guangzhou. Her master, a wealthy merchant, consistently withheld portions of her already meager wages, claiming defects in her work that were often fabricated. Wen, skilled and diligent, knew this was a lie, a simple tactic to increase his profits. However, how could she challenge him? To formally accuse a powerful merchant in a Tang court was an unimaginable feat for a common woman. She would need male family members to represent her, who might be unwilling or fearful of antagonizing someone so influential. Her testimony would be viewed with skepticism, especially against a man of higher status. Furthermore, the very societal structure reinforced the idea that women's primary role was domestic and subservient. A woman challenging a male employer in public would be seen as immodest or disruptive to social harmony. There were no mechanisms for collective bargaining, no labor unions, no social support systems for exploited workers. The legal system, while theoretically open to all, was practically inaccessible to women, especially those without powerful male patrons. Comprehensive historical analyses of Tang legal precedents reveal how women's rights in property or contract disputes were often mediated by family structures, and individual women, particularly those of lower social standing, faced immense hurdles in pursuing independent legal action, leaving them vulnerable to arbitrary decisions by employers. Across the vast Abbasid Caliphate, despite certain legal protections for women in specific areas like marriage and inheritance, the reality of legal recourse for women workers facing exploitation was similarly brave. She worked tirelessly, fulfilling every demand, but was often subjected to physical abuse by the head housekeeper, who held immense power within the household. On one particularly harsh day, Jamila was severely beaten for a minor mistake, leaving her bruised and traumatized. Where could Jamila turn? She was an enslaved woman, or a bondservant, meaning her legal standing was minimal. To report the abuse would require the intervention of her master, who might be unwilling to upset his household hierarchy, or who might even condone the violence as a form of discipline. If she tried to escape, she faced severe punishment. There was no independent authority she could approach, no public protector of the vulnerable. Her only hope lay in the mercy of her master, a mercy that was rarely extended in such circumstances. Islamic legal scholarship of the period, while outlining rules for the treatment of enslaved people, primarily placed enforcement within the master's domain, leaving little external avenue for slaves, especially women, to independently seek justice against their owners or overseers for mistreatment or withheld payment. This fundamental lack of legal and social avenues for redress meant that countless women in 760 AD, trapped in cycles of exploitation, had no voice, no power, and no escape from their relentless suffering.